Welcome, everyone, to Spokane Community College Hagen Center Speaker Series, Diversity Dialogues. I see you, I hear you, I feel you. Conversations about race and equity. I would like to begin by acknowledging that we present this program from the traditional lands of the Spokane people who have stewarded this land for many generations. The presentation you are about to enjoy is a collaboration between Humanities Washington Speaker Bureau program and SCC's Hagen Center for the Humanities. Humanities Washington is a nonprofit organization dedicated to sparking conversation and critical thinking, and it provides many other cultural programs to hundreds of thousands of people throughout Washington each year. You can find more information on Humanities Washington by visiting our website, www.humanities.org. You can also find more information about our Hagen Speaker Series at scc.spokane.edu/Hagen Center. For those of you joining us via YouTube, feel free to comment any questions you may have during the presentation, and we'll take note of them. And at the end, when we have time, at the end of the presentation, we will ask Dr. Abe on your behalf. Let me introduce Dr. Daudi Abe. He is a professor, writer, and historian who has taught and written about race, gender, education, hip hop, and sports for over 20 years. His books include the newly released Emerald Street, A History of Hip Hop in Seattle, and his work has appeared in The Stranger and the Seattle Times. Dr. Abe holds an MA in Human Development and a PhD in Education from the University of Washington, where he resides in Seattle. Welcome, Dr. Abe.
Hello. Thank you. Saying I gotta have the mic off mute quicker than that. But thank you. It's my pleasure to be among you all this evening. And probably before I get into the meat of what we're here to talk about today, I should talk a little bit about the title of this presentation. The title is "Why Are All the Black Kids Sitting Together in the Principal's Office?" And it is a sample from a book from the 1990s by a woman named Dr. Beverly Tatum called "Why Are All the Black Kids Sitting Together in the Cafeteria?" And that book was, kind of more about identity development and that kind of thing. And so that was released in the 1990s. And maybe a couple, 3 years ago, that would have been like the 20th anniversary of the releasing of that book. And Dr. Tatum went on a tour. She came to Seattle. So I was asked to do kind of like a little warm-up exercise and then introduce her as she came to stage and engage in conversation about her book. So in honor of Dr. Tatum and her book and the reason why she was in town, I called because I was focusing on disproportionate discipline. And so I decided to call it "Why Are All the Black Kids Sitting Together in the Principal's Office?" So Dr. Tatum and I were speaking backstage before I was getting ready to introduce her, and I was telling her what I'd done. I was telling her that I had sampled the title of her book for this particular presentation, but I was like, that was just a one-time thing, and I won't do that anymore. And she was like, "No, this is a very important question that you're asking, and it's a question that needs to keep being asked." And so we arrive here with the title of this presentation, having had the blessing of the woman who inspired it. Okay, here we are with all right. So let us do what we might call a little bit of a local critical race theorizing. And here's a question. How do we make sense of an area that has a long and historic progressive racial tradition while also having some of the most pronounced law enforcement and educational disparities in the nation? So what do we mean when people say that this area of the country has a relatively progressive racial reputation around issues of race? Well, what does that mean? What does that exactly look like? Well, here's an example. One example is that Washington's African-American men voted throughout the territorial period, and the Washington Territorial Suffrage Act of 1883 briefly made it possible for Black women to cast ballots until women's suffrage was struck down by the Territorial Supreme Court in 1887. And so that what that means is that Black men and women were voting in Washington during the 1880s. Now, I don't even really need to tell you about places like in the Deep South in the 1960s and the 1970s and what that meant for people of color and specifically for Black people who were trying to vote. And you know what I'm saying? I could even talk about today and issues about voter access and questions about suppression. But I'm talking about back then in the 1800s or in the 1880s rather. This was the case. That was something that having to fight for the ballot was not necessarily something that was front and center for Black residents in Washington State. It's another historic example. Another historic example would be the story of Barry Lawson. This is in 1938. Barry Lawson was an African-American, 27-year-old African-American who worked as a waiter in the Mount Fuji Hotel, which is in downtown Seattle on Yesler Street. The building is actually still there. So he works as a waiter in this hotel. And in this hotel one day in March of 1938, Barry Lawson is observed sleeping in a chair in the lobby of this hotel in which he works. 3 white Seattle police officers approach Barry Lawson and make contact with him. About an hour and a half after this, Barry Lawson is pronounced dead in the hospital with a fractured skull. The police officers said at the time that after they contacted Barry Lawson, he appeared to be high on something. He broke free from their grasp and flung himself down a flight of stairs, and that's how he ended up dead with a fractured skull. The local Black community was not going for this story. So after a series of protest meetings at the mayor's office and also at the office of the chief of police, these 3 officers were suspended, then they were fired, then they were indicted, then they were put on trial, then they were found guilty, and then they were all sentenced to 20-year terms apiece in this death of Barry Lawson. Now, a couple of months into serving these sentences, the governor of Washington at the time commuted the sentences of all 3 of these officers, and they all walked out of prison. And as the last officer walked out of prison, he took responsibility for the death of Barry Lawson. Now, even though justice ultimately was not served in this case, the simple fact that it got this far in 1938 is stunning to me. It's still stunning to me. I got to tell you, I have a hard time imagining something like this happening today, much less 80-something years ago. So that's what I mean when I'm talking about being a little bit ahead of the racial curve. It's certainly not to say, obviously, by this story, that racism and discrimination did not and don't exist here. But it looks different in a lot of ways than it does in some other places around the country. So what do we mean when we're talking about disproportionality? Well, I teach a hip hop culture class at Seattle Central College. I have been for almost 20 years now. And one of the units of analysis that we do in that class is kind of a critical reading of the crack epidemic of the 1980s and kind of viewing it through a hip hop lens and what was hip hop saying about crack at the time. And so a part of that is kind of reading about some of the effects around, what would I be saying? Like some of the legislative effects, if we can call them that. And one of those that came out of this hysteria that surrounded crack in the 1980s became known as the 100-to-1 rule. And the 100-to-1 rule stated that if you were caught with 5 grams of crack, you would be subject to the same amount of prison time as someone who was caught with 500 grams of powder. So in this situation, people were getting more time for having less drugs. I would probably just add in right here that if we kind of juxtapose the response to what was happening with crack versus in the 80s and 90s versus what's happening with the opioid crisis right now, we could, it is plain to see that the solution for the crack epidemic was incarceration based, where the solution for the opioid problem seems to be steering much more toward a treatment-based solution. But what I really wanted to point out here is that this 100-to-1 rule was repealed in 2009, and it was brought down to something like 17-to-1 or somewhere in that range. But what I want to call your attention to in this article is, I don't know if you can see my arrow, but I'm focusing in on this paragraph that's in the third far right column, third column farthest to the right. It's saying in 2007, 82% of people convicted on crack possession charges were Black and 9% were white, although only about 25% of crack users are African American. So what that's saying is that this group of 25% of African American people who smoke crack account for 82% of all people convicted of crack possession. So that's disproportionate. If we're talking about proportionality, we're talking about, okay, if they make up 25% of the users, then maybe roughly 25%, maybe 30%, they should make up of the people who are convicted on crack possession. But no, that's 25 accounting for 82. That's what we mean. That's what I'm talking about here around disproportionality. And we can see that this is not the case only in the criminal justice system. We can see by the headline on this slide here that even in the military, Black people are punished disproportionately. And there's an interesting thing in this story here, because further into the story, it talks to some of these, the white commanding officers are overwhelmingly white. And one thing that they said in this story is that they feel closer relationships to their subordinates that look like them as opposed to Black soldiers who are under their command. And so when we're talking about going back to school, I mean, a lot of times I think, part of this is marketing, certainly, but a lot of times the back to school phenomenon is framed as something that's exciting and that people are looking forward to, and that it's that special time of year. And that certainly may be the case for some students, but for many other students, this is a time of anxiety. This is a time of nervousness, and it can be a time of depression based on past experiences and what some of these students feel like they have to look forward to at the beginning of the next school year. So I'm going to walk us back here a little bit just to try to give a little bit of context in terms of like how long the things that I'm talking about here have been going on. I'm using Seattle as an example, but this phenomenon is happening all around the country. Okay, so what we see here is we see a headline. This is an article from 2020. And the article says, Black-white divide in Seattle schools gifted programs, discipline rates among worst in the nation. So the gifted school issue is one problem, and the discipline rates that they're talking about here are entirely other problems. So let's take it back a little bit further then. Here's an article from 2013. And the headline from this article says, Feds probing Seattle schools' treatment of Black students. As the U.S. Department of Education investigates whether Seattle public schools discriminated against African-American students by disciplining them more frequently and more harshly, superintendent at the time, Jose Banda, promises to find solutions. All right, so that was what, 2013? So now let me take us even a little bit further back. And this is an article from 2001. And I have to, I look at this article with nostalgia is not the right word, because it ain't like this is good news. I look back on it just as kind of an important piece, because it was this headline and this article that kind of steered me toward what would eventually become my dissertation topic. So this is from 2001, and it says, Black students face more discipline. Black middle school students in Seattle public schools are 3 times as likely to be disciplined as students in other ethnic groups. And Black high school students are twice as likely to face discipline, according to a new district analysis. Now, this paragraph is pulled out from further in this article, and it gets back, it kind of illustrates that issue of disproportionality that I was talking about before. So while 23% of last year's high school students were Black, they accounted for 40% of those disciplined. For middle school students, 22% were Black, but they accounted for 46% of disciplinary actions. No other ethnic group showed such a gap. Roughly 2/3 of the punishments at both middle and high school levels went to males. So now we're talking about not only a racial dynamic here, but also a gender dynamic that exists in the discussion around the what and whys around discipline, especially as it relates to these Black students in Seattle Public Schools. So I want to take a brief moment just to talk a little bit about a couple of terms that I think a lot of people use interchangeably when having these conversations, discipline and punishment. I look at punishment. I look at the word punishment, and I think of obviously the root word, and I think of punitive, and I just intuitively it feels like that is not the vibe around that word is not something that encourages learning moments or teachable moments. Whereas and this is just me and my interpretation of the terms. But so when I think of discipline, I'm a kid of the 80s. I was a teenager in the 80s, and I used to love on Sunday mornings to watch wrestling. And then after wrestling would be Kung Fu theater. And what I'm saying? It was two champions of Shaolin and flying guillotine and one-armed swordsmen, and executioners from Shaolin and Shaolin Mantis, and just all these flicks. So, obviously at the end, there would always be a big fight scene and somebody would avenge either their slain teacher or their family or something like that. But for me, what really stuck out in those films was the training, the practice, all of the time put into the buildup for that last kind of confrontation. And that reminds me, that makes me think of discipline. And that makes me think that there can be a positive aspect to discipline. And even though it may not necessarily be something that you enjoy or something that you find fun at the time, you can still pull learning out of it without it necessarily being just all about punishment and being punitive. I think that kind of defeats the purpose a lot of times, especially as we get a little bit further, you'll probably see more what I'm talking about. Okay, so now I'm continuing to walk us back. And now we go to an article from 2001. And this article was actually, so this one came out. And then there was, in response to this article, there was a community meeting called. And this article covered that community meeting. The title of it was "All of Us Are to Blame. Little has been done about racial disparities in school discipline," attorney said. Okay, so now I'm going to read this the first sentence from this article from 2001. About 20 years ago, the Seattle Public Schools assigned a committee to look at why Black students were more likely than others to be suspended or expelled. Now I'm just going to stop right there. And I'm going to say that if this article from 2001 is saying about 20 years ago, that means that we're actually going back to the early 1980s to when the Seattle Public School, the district actually found out about it. So, if they're finding out about it in the early 80s, that the problem had to have been going on much longer for it to rise up to the level where the district finally pays attention to it. So we're talking about now back into the 70s, we're talking about going on a good 50 years now, 40 to 50 years of intergenerational educational trauma around Black community members in Seattle's experiences with Seattle Public Schools. Now I want to highlight a brief distinction here before we get too deep into the weeds around the idea of discipline. I want to kind of, when I first started talking to when that article, that 2001 article came out with the headline "Black Students Face More Discipline," I was very early on in the program, in the doctoral program at the University of Washington. And I remember that article catching my eye, and I remember talking about it with some of my cohort members. And I remember some of those cohort members being like, well, when it came to Black students being suspended, they were like, well, if they, wouldn't bring weapons to school and wouldn't fight, they probably would be able to stay in school. And I remember thinking, that doesn't sound exactly right. And so what we have here is the idea of a couple of different types of discipline. For objective discipline, we would say that these are the types of disciplinary offenses that do not leave a whole lot of room for interpretation. So I might say something like bringing a weapon to school. I might say something like if little Billy is sitting in class and little Billy gets up and walks over to little Tommy and punches little Tommy in the head, can't have that in the classroom. So I'm saying these types of behaviors and situations don't leave a lot of room for interpretation. However, if we're talking about subjective discipline, we might be talking about something like, a type of behavior where, a kid has trouble sitting still in class. And that becomes, a problem for some teacher who is, just used to commanding kids to just sit still, be quiet, and just feed everything I take you. And I've seen instances where a kid like that, literally with my own eyes, a kid like that in one class is viewed as a problem and sent out of class to the principal's office, and in another class is viewed as being someone who is anxious and excited about learning. And simply based on what the teacher is doing and how the teacher is dealing with the situation makes all the difference in whether or not that student remains in the classroom. Okay, so here are a couple of points that I want to make regarding communication styles. And this is a quote from a book called Culturally Responsive Teaching. It is by a woman named Geneva Gay. And in the interest of full disclosure, Geneva Gay was the chair of my dissertation committee while I was at UW. And I'm not including this just simply because I love Geneva, and I do, but because she literally wrote the book on culturally responsive teaching. So here's what she's saying. She's saying that the discourse dynamics of European Americans are almost the opposite of African Americans. She's saying that they believe that emotions interfere with one's capacity to reason and quality of reasoning. Thus, European Americans try to avoid or minimize opposition and dialogue, especially when members of ethnic minority groups are involved, because they think they assume it will be confrontational, divisive, and lead to intransigence or the further entrenchment of opposing viewpoints. They aim to control impulse and emotion. Okay, and so what we're talking about here is the vast majority of teachers in this state and around the country, actually. So here's also something from Dr. Gay. And here she is talking about communication styles of African Americans. So she's saying here, among African Americans, the participatory interactive style of communicating is sometimes referred to as call response. It involves listeners giving encouragement, commentary, compliments, and even criticism to speakers as they are talking. If anybody here has ever been to a Black church, then you know what I mean. As the preacher is preaching, if the congregation is not speaking back to the preacher while the preacher is saying what he's saying, preacher's going to think there's something wrong. Dr. Gay is saying, African Americans gain the floor, get participatory entry into conversations through personal assertiveness, the strength of impulse to be involved, and the persuasive power of the point they wish to make, rather than waiting for an authority to grant permission. Now, this is important because, as Dr. Gay goes on to point out, many teachers consider these behaviors negatively as rude, inconsiderate, disruptive, and speaking out of turn, and they penalize students for them. Now, the question of failure in school has, for the longest time, been pointed at the student and family. And this is, really in a lot of ways been reinforced, especially when it comes to bicultural students and students of color. In her book, Culture and Power in the Classroom, Antonia Darder argued that among bicultural students, hierarchical socialization is then further reinforced by the fact that success or failure in school is considered an individual responsibility. When bicultural students perform poorly, it is clearly considered the student's fault, as opposed to the teacher kind of doing some professional introspection and thinking about, how or in what ways did I consider to the failure, or did I contribute rather to the failures of this student? Okay, so here's where we start to get our hands dirty a little bit with talking about some of the points I was making earlier. So these are figures taken out of the from the article All of Us Are to Blame, which was covering that community meeting. That was in response to the other article about Black students facing more discipline. So it's saying a further breakdown of the discipline figures show that disruptive conduct is the most frequent reason cited for suspensions and expulsions, accounting for 29% of total, with fighting following at 16.9%, disobedience at 16.7%, assault at 7.7%, and rule breaking at 7%. The other in the spectrum, burglary, robbery, bomb threats, pulling false fire alarms, et cetera, accounted for 0.1% each. We won't even pay attention to those, to the little 0.1 stuff. But what I want to go through here is kind of parse out and designate some of these reasons as either objective or subjective. Okay, so if we start up here and we say that disruptive conduct, the most frequent reason cited, accounting for 30%, almost 29.4%, I'm going to say that disruptive conduct will fall under the subjective category. Okay. And as we say, we go on, we say fighting following at 16.9%. Okay. We will say that fighting falls under the objective disciplinary category. Okay. Disobedience at 16.7%, I'm going to call that subjective. Assault at 7.7%, I'm going to call that objective. And rule breaking at 7%. And let me tell you something. All my years visiting and observing teachers in their classrooms, there have been some situations where there were so many rules on the walls of these classrooms, I was breaking like 3 of them as soon as I walked in. Okay, so I'm going to call rule breaking subjective. So let us go through here and put these together then and say the disruptive conduct, 29%, disobedience, 16%, rule breaking, 7%. And I didn't major in math during my time in my program, but I think that 27 plus 16 plus 7 gives us more than 50. So what that means is that over half the time, the reasons being given for the suspensions and expulsions of these Black students fall under the subjective category. Now, am I saying that none of these students who are being sent home or being suspended, that none of them are being disruptive, or that none of them are being disobedient, or that none of them are breaking rules? No, I'm not saying that. But I am saying that when these type of subjective issues come to the forefront and we have such cultural distance between the population of teachers that are currently staffing schools and the multiracial, multicultural classroom that they're teaching, that's enough for me to start asking questions. And we're not only talking about kids. Here we have a breakdown of teachers in Seattle Public Schools. White teachers by far make up the greatest number. And in this column here, we have the percent of them that rated unsatisfactory in their teacher evaluations. Now, if we go down here and we go down to the African-American teachers, there's only 160 of them, yet 5.6% of them rated unsatisfactory. And again, this is where we're getting back to the idea of disproportionality. And if you're going to tell me that even among teachers, even among adults, so if you're going to tell me that kids are unaware of the dynamics that exist between the adults in their building, I'm going to say you're not giving kids proper credit for how perceptive they are about what's going on around them. So then what are we talking about as far as like how students respond to these situations? Well, a couple of points that I would bring up here are the concepts of academic self-esteem and cool pose. So beginning with academic self-esteem, this is basically like how a student views themselves. Am I smart? Do I belong in school? Am I college material? You know what I'm saying? And it is easy for a student's academic self-esteem to be battered and bruised at an early age. And I'll get into that in just a second. But the other part is Cool Pose. And Cool Pose is actually so in the hip hop class that I teach, before we even get into anything related to the South Bronx or DJing or emceeing or anything like that, we spend some time exploring kind of the socio-political aspects of African American history in this country. And so talking about Cool Pose, and Cool Pose is one of those things. And so Cool Pose comes from a book. The subtitle is The Dilemmas of Black Manhood in America. And so this book is defining Cool Pose as a ritualized form of masculinity that entails behaviors, scripts, physical posturing, impression management, and carefully crafted performances that deliver a single critical message: pride, strength, and control. So like, even if everything in my life is going to hell around me, you will never be able to tell, because I wear the mask all the time. And making myself vulnerable is not only something that's emotionally vulnerable, is not only something that's discouraged in men overall, but particularly discouraged in Black men. Because the idea is, you know, even if everything is bad, I'm not going to let you know that you're getting the best of me, so to speak. Okay. But there is a kind of an inverse relationship between the notion of academic self-esteem and Cool Pose. When people's academic self-esteem starts to go down, the Cool Pose starts to go up. And a lot of times teachers misread that as like, oh, see, I told you the kid didn't really care about education. I told you the kid must come from a household where they don't care about education. And so misreading Cool Pose for indifference and not caring, without taking into account the role that declining academic self-esteem plays in that dynamic, is almost completely missing the point, which happens every single day in schools, every day. And so, you know, when I did my dissertation, I finished my dissertation in 2004. So at that time, I was focusing on grades 4 through 8, because that was right around the time, just in the lead up to middle school, was right around the time when the achievement gap began to really reveal itself, not only grades wise, but also the discipline gap that I was talking about a little bit earlier. So that was kind of the key time that I was focusing in on. In the time since, there has been research and reports coming out that these issues of disproportionality in school, for Black students anyway, begin as early as preschool. And you see a headline here like this: Black preschoolers far more likely to be suspended. Now, I gotta tell you, I was doing a parents' night at a local elementary school here in Seattle, probably like a couple, 3 years ago. And I was talking about this. I was talking about this exact same thing. And there was a Black mother in the audience. And at the end, she was talking to me, and she was saying how her daughter, a little Black girl in preschool, had been suspended from school for what? Wait for it. For not taking a nap. And I remember being stunned by that. And then I remember thinking, okay, really, is that really how it goes down now? Because let's just assume that this little girl doesn't really find preschool all that fun. And now she has found a way where maybe, let's say there's a little brother at home, or a little sister, and a little baby sister at home, and that she just loves being around and doesn't, like I said, doesn't like being away, doesn't like preschool. She's now found a way to get to go home early. But in the meantime, her student file is starting to be, her preschool student file is starting to be filled up with these notices of suspension. And so by the time she's going to go to kindergarten, that file, man, these files follow you like an arrest record. That file is going to go on to the kindergarten teacher, and the kindergarten teacher could very well be like, oh, wow, we have a problem on our hands already. And so the beating that academic self-esteem in some students takes from a very, very, very young age is it's heartbreaking in a lot of ways. Especially, again, we're talking about preschoolers, man. What are we really suspending preschoolers for? Where did that come from? Whose idea was that? Okay. So here's another little story that comes that will illustrate this slide here. So another few years ago, I was doing what they called a LLD, a Learning and Leadership Day, for all the principals in Seattle Public Schools. Every principal from every elementary, middle school, and high school came for a day of professional development. And here I was talking about some of these things here that I'm talking about here today with that group. And one of the principals came up to me afterward. And he said that he had run a student survey in his building. And one of the items, it wasn't a question here, but you can see one of the items here said that if I am not at school, there will be an adult who misses me. Excuse me, after they got the results of the survey and kind of disaggregated the data, this principal found out that 80% of the Black kids in his school answered no to this. 80%, 8 out of 10 Black kids in his school think that if they are not at school, there will not be an adult who misses them. Which is, again, which makes me sad, you know what I'm saying? Because we think about school and schools think about themselves as places where they are supposed to be to help kids speak up for themselves and be advocates, okay? So I went and did some digging through some school district materials to try to really kind of make sense of it. And I found one that was called Maximizing Instructional Time by Supporting the Whole Child. And this was an Seattle Public Schools document from 2016. And it lists some rights and responsibilities of students. And one student right is to be known and cared for at school. Well, you know what I'm saying? I think that the 80% of Black kids at that particular school that answered no to the question on the survey would have serious questions about this right that they are supposed to have at school. Another one, a responsibility, student responsibilities. One of them, share with a trusted adult at the school when they are experiencing emotional and or physical stressors for the purpose of obtaining resources or support. Again, I think that on its face that the idea of this is great because you definitely want, in an ideal situation, you want kids and students to be able to advocate for themselves and communicate and say what it is they need. But again, if you're saying that this is a responsibility for a student, one of those 80% of Black students in that school, that's a big ask. Because here you're assuming that there's a trusted adult with this responsibility. And those students just got done saying how they don't think there's any adult who will miss them if they're not there. So that's a big ask of a student. Another student responsibility, advocate for their educational, cultural, social, and emotional needs. Again, I like the idea, but again, you know what I'm saying? You can't just put that out there and have all of these students who have been affected in so many ways and bring so much traumatic baggage with them to these educational environments that you can't just throw that out there and say, oh yeah, go for it. And then if they don't do it, say, oh, well, you should advocate it for yourself. You know what I'm saying? That was going to be a big, big deal for them to try to pull off in the first place. So then what are some strategies? Well, I can tell you what one strategy ain't, and that's saying this. Now, I've been around enough teachers and enough classrooms to where I just have to just, you know what I'm saying, just stop people from saying this. If they do say it, if they get it out before I can cut them off, I have to tell them, please, please don't be that person. Stop saying this. Because, you know what I'm saying, people that say this, I'm not saying you're lying, but I have to believe that this is either people that are going to go ahead and try to say this, especially within education, are either naive at best or at worst disingenuous. Just because the realities of race are kind of broadcast to all of us in this country through various means. And so I think we see color just like we see height, just like we see gender, just like we see if somebody's wearing a hat or not, just like we see if somebody's got long hair or short hair. It's just something that we have been trained to pay attention to. And it's completely, and it's problematic because it really just dismisses the experiences that people of color, students of color, bring to the classroom. And it is a completely privileged point of view to come from, because historically speaking, people of color have had to see color basically as a matter of survival. Now, part of what the district was trying to do, has been trying to do, is implementing new policies. And one of these was rolled out a couple of years ago. And it eliminates what they are calling willful defiance in grades K through 5. And that willful defiance essentially is talking about subjective disciplinary stuff in grades K through 5. And so I was kind of brought in to do some consulting as they were crafting this policy. And my main question was, why are we just talking about K through 5? Because Oakland, the Oakland school district did something like this, and they went straight K through 12, not just K through 5. And so, the answer I kind of got was, we don't want to shock the system. We'll eventually expand it through K through 12. But, again, my concern was like, the research says that right around 5th grade and forward is where a lot of these students start having trouble. So why cut it off at that point? That seems a little bit counterintuitive, but I digress. Just as a side note, it is not necessarily helped, and the district is still struggling with these rates as they continue to get worse and not necessarily better. So that just goes to show you, knowing the problem is there and taking effective steps to counteract it are two completely different things. So the other point that I want to just make right quick is the idea of out of school versus out of seat time, and the notion that's out of school suspension, eliminating out of school suspension. Well, if you're not sending kids home, but you're still taking them out of the classroom and putting them like in a detention room, that means they're still out of the classroom, out of their seat, and falling behind their classmates academically. So one does not necessarily, it may help in a public relations sense where you're saying we're not sending kids home, but in a practical sense, it essentially kind of perpetuates the problem that that was trying to be addressed from the beginning. Okay, so here's the title of my dissertation. It's long, so I have to write it down so I can remember. But it was the effects of non-traditional instruction on the classroom discipline of African American students, grades 4 through 8. And I told you why I was focusing on grades 4. This is just because of the appearance of the achievement gap and discipline gaps. Now, I just knew when I started this research project that the things that were going to keep students in the classroom were relevant curriculum, which means you're presenting curriculum that's relevant to the lives of the students you're working with, and engaging instructional methods, where you don't just have students just stuck in the passive receptive posture and the teacher is just, talking at them. I'm always reminded when I get to this part, I'm always reminded of the movie Ferris Bueller's Day Off, and Ferris's teacher in high school, Bueller, anybody, Bueller, I don't know how many people, I don't know what the age range of people listening get that reference, but just dry, just nothing engaging about it at all. So as I made my way through this project and writing this dissertation, my data points were classroom observations, teacher interviews, and student interviews. These things did come up. And in the final analysis of once I was done, yes, relevant curriculum was an important factor. And yes, engaging instructional methods was an important factor. But these two things finished second and third, far behind the number one factor in reducing classroom discipline. Here, if we were in person, here's where I would be throwing it out to the audience to see if anybody has an idea about what that number one thing was. But since we don't, I'm gonna go ahead and share it anyway. Share it just now. And the number one thing was, drum roll, personal relationships. Now, I think, because I taught K through 8 for 8 years in the 1990s. And I think that probably intuitively I knew that, but I'm not sure that I'd ever really expressed that explicitly. And so when I talk to teachers now, you know what I'm saying, and I talk about personal relationships, a lot of them are like, well, of course I have a relationship with my students. I spend 5 days a week with them, 6 hours a day, you know, and I'm saying, I'm talking about something a little bit more intentional. I'm talking about something where you're going out of your way to highlight that relationship and make that relationship stand out in the mind of your students. So here's where it gets a little bit rocky, because in culturally responsive teaching, Geneva Gay described a traditional way of women's communication as, quote, focusing on individuals and establishing friendships, networks, intimacy, and relationships more than exhibiting power, accomplishment, or control. So here's where it starts to get a little bit uncomfortable, because given that roughly 90% of teachers in Washington or state are women, what is this? What do you do with this uncomfortable question? If research suggests that female communicative discourse is primarily relationship-based, then what exactly is preventing these teachers from creating meaningful connections with the students who are being removed from their classrooms? And a lot of times when it's in person, you know what I'm saying, I start to get the body language of some people in the audience. It starts to tense up, or they take their phones out and kind of, but I mean, it's a real question. And I think part of the answer lies in this brilliant term here that's highlighted here in the headline of this story here. Leading professor contends that many teachers are, quote, sympathetic destroyers of Black boys' dreams. And I'm talking about like, even, it doesn't have to be that the teacher is like overtly racist and like goes home and puts on, you know what I'm saying, his Confederate flag t-shirt and turns on Fox News. It doesn't have to be like that. I think so often what we have within teachers who are failing these students are teachers who are sympathetic and do feel bad about what's happening to them, but in their praxis are not engaged in the delivery of their curriculum and having it be relative to where it makes a difference, and it impresses upon these students that they are special and that their teacher believes that they can be successful even if they are having trouble believing that themselves. So I think the idea of the sympathetic destroyer is just, it's a great way to put it, because it says so much about the unintended consequences, I guess, if you want to say that, but the results are still the same, whether somebody is overtly not liking these students that they're teaching or somebody has genuine sympathy for them. None of that really matters in the final analysis, because so often the result is the same. And it's this kind of this passive oppression that really in a lot of ways fuels this gap here. And it is the extension of these negative expectations that have fueled this phenomenon that we've seen, especially in the last several years, of white people calling the police on Black people simply for being Black in a public space. So that's what I mean about the extension and kind of the what's the word I'm looking for? The extension, but the projection of these negative expectations. And so, speaking of negative expectations or positive expectations, I mean, if you are a fan of the saying that success is a function of expectation, this should be interesting to you. And this is based on a research project from the 1960s called Pygmalion in the Classroom. And this was a 1965 experiment in a public elementary school. the teachers were told that certain children could be expected to be, quote, growth spurters based on the students' results on the Harvard test of inflected acquisition. I love the name of that test, because in reality, there was no such test. And those children designated as spurters were chosen at random. The researchers hoped to determine the degree, if any, to which changes in teacher expectation produce changes in student achievement. So in reality, the researchers chose the school at random. They chose the teachers in the classroom at random, and they chose the students at random, but told the teachers that can expect big things. So what do you think happened over the course of the school year with the kids that they identified as spurters? I think I can hear you out there saying, well, they spurted. And yes, if you said that or were thinking that, you would be correct. But here's the thing. As the researchers were making their observations, one thing that they found was that the teachers were not spending more time with the spurters than they were with the children who were not identified as spurters. So what does that tell us? That tells us that it is not the quantity of time that a teacher spends with a student, it is the quality of the interaction that makes the most difference. And speaking to that, an analysis of Native Americans at the Warm Springs Reservation in Oregon found, quote, many of the achievement problems of the students in this study derived from the interactional and procedural protocols of teaching rather than the substantive content of what was taught. How teachers talked to students interfered more with their academic engagement than the topics being discussed. Now, I have to say that it's important, and I've been very big about talking to teachers and prospective teaching candidates about the fact that just being a person of color is not an automatic qualifier to be effective with students of color. In fact, it can be even more devastating, because I've seen and I've heard stories told by students who were like, finally, I have a teacher that looks like me. And the end result was the exact same. And so now they're feeling like, what hope do they have? And in the same way, being a white teacher does not automatically disqualify one from being effective with students of color. I was saying that I taught in the 1990s at a predominantly Black K through 8 private school. And as I was teaching middle school there was a white woman from West Glacier, Montana, who went to Kansas State University, probably, as I imagine them to be, and as she said, two of the least diverse places that you're going to find in Manhattan, Kansas State University, in this country. And yet she came in and was just fantastic with these Black teenagers. And why? Because she was, honest. She was straightforward. She was firm. She was not intimidated. And she was able to instill confidence and belief in a lot of these students, again, when they didn't necessarily have that for themselves. And then also, the second point here is that I feel like, this is just my opinion, regular professional introspection and reflection is necessary for us all, but especially for those in gatekeeper occupations. Not only would teachers qualify as gatekeeper occupations, but also police officers. And this discussion about trying to increase the racial competency of teachers has spilled over into law enforcement. And so now for the past several years now, I've been working with the Washington State Criminal Justice Training Commission, which is basically the police academy of Washington State, to help permanently institute a history of race and policing course that police cadets have to take as they are going through the academy. So in the same way that they're taking target practice, in the same way that they're taking self-defense, in the same way that they're taking all of the paralegal stuff that they have to know, they also need to be taking this class that discusses issues around race and how race affects how they do that job. Waiting until they get on the street, until they have to really grapple and think about these things, is doing a disservice not only to the police officers who are going out there, but to the public whom they are supposed to serve. early on in my career, I was told by the man who hired me at that K-8 school I keep talking about, that I was going to have to decide: am I a teacher who's Black or a Black man who is a teacher? And at first I was a little confused, but over the years I've really come to appreciate that question and kind of the subtle differences there. If I'm a teacher who's Black, I look at it as, if I'm a teacher who's Black, okay, I come to work, I try to do what I can. I want to see kids do well. And, at the end of the day, I leave my work at school and I get my check and I go home. But if I'm a Black man who's a teacher, then I am trying to exercise some intentionality around the fact that I am entering into an institution that has had historically negative outcomes towards people that look like me and towards people that look like my children. And so how am I going to purposefully, intentionally try to craft what I am doing in this job to disrupt that phenomenon? What am I going to do to disrupt the negative outcomes, the historically negative outcomes? How am I going to be conscious and doing what I can to make sure that the historic kind of numbers and poor outcomes, negative outcomes, that I can do something to push back against that? So I think that there are subtle differences there. Because in a lot of ways, what we're talking about here is the school to prison pipeline. And I gave this presentation to a group of to the Black Prisoners Caucus at the State Penitentiary in Monroe. It's about 30 miles outside of here in Seattle. And man, about a dozen of these cats afterward came and got at me and was like, yo, my path to lockdown started just with the kind of subjective stuff you were talking about in school, right around middle school. And it is a very real phenomenon, and something that, in a lot of ways, has the decision being made for kids about whether they want to go to college or whether they're even able to go to college before they even get to high school. And we can see this. We can see it in situations like this. Is an incident from a couple of years ago at a high school in South Carolina. It was a Black girl. She was sitting at her desk, and granted, she was being belligerent. She just had her phone right up in front of her face, was ignoring the teacher who was asking her to leave the classroom. So the teacher calls in the school resource officer, and the school resource officer literally comes in and body slams her while she's still sitting at her desk and drags her out of the room. This is a disproportionate response to the situation that was happening. You have another instance, a 6-year-old Black girl handcuffed at a school in Florida because she hit a staff member. This is the criminalization of non-criminal acts or behavior. And it is this type of over the top that really, has a crushing effect on the academic self-esteem of students. And again, the inverse relationship, the academic self-esteem goes down, the cool pose comes up. And when the cool pose comes up, the likelihood of further conflict also goes up. And it's not just a situation where we're talking about K through 12. I've had the opportunity to teach all levels, kindergarten all the way up through grad school. And you can draw a through line between the issues facing a lot of these younger kids at younger ages and younger grades and what happens in higher ed. So this is a slide from in 2010, I want to say. There was data from Seattle Central, where I teach, that said that Black male students were the least retained population on campus. And that spurred us to try to get to the bottom of that. And so we started a project called The Village. And so we met with Black students, Black male students who wanted to participate, tried to recruit them, try to get them in, met with them every other week, did stuff like brought in guest speakers from places like the financial aid office, office and the registration office and trying to get, you know what I'm saying, familiar faces where people can go and be comfortable and you know what I'm saying, get what they need from around campus. And so we had this slide and we were able to give some statistical evidence that the Black male students who participated in the village had a higher retention rate than those who did not. But the themes over here on the left are the main thing, one of the main things anyway. And they're talking about community, they're talking about resources, they're talking about empowerment, about validation, they're talking about fellowship. And these are themes that exist in all grade levels and things that all students need and point to as factors that when they are present, help them be more successful. Another way to fight back and push back is another program that involved in at Seattle Central, which is called the Academy for Rising Educators. It is, our mission is to recruit, train, and get certified diverse groups of potential teachers. And, you know, a lot of them are coming out where they're in this AA program. And so we don't really have a grade point requirement. And for a lot of of our cohort members, there are students who did not have the greatest experience in school. And there's, again, some academic trauma that they're bringing to the table. But I think, I look at them and I think, who better to be able to relate to and give empathy and compassion to a student that is struggling in a way that they can so clearly identify with. And so in a program like this, I'm not so worried about whether a teacher can create a lesson plan or knows what an anticipatory set is or is able to design effective assessments. So that technical aspect, I'm confident that a lot of teachers are on top of them and had down. What I'm not so confident in is racial competency. And again, not simply because there are a number of candidates of color in this program, again, it's not that automatic qualifier. And it's something that we have to keep going back to and making sure that they are aware of and cognizant of and bringing into everything that they do with regard to being culturally responsive, with regard to being anti-racist, and with regard to practicing student-centered pedagogy that really focuses on and develops relationships. And then lastly here, one thing that I get from a lot of people is that you know, there are some kids who are just too young to have these critical kind of conversations around race. And I would draw your attention to this little cartoon here, this cartoon on this page. And this is from a curriculum book from New York City Public Schools. And it's quite old, but I'll show you here. So what we have here is the cartoon. And the cartoon has a Black soldier faced with a white sheriff. The sign on the building says Alabama County, no Negro voting permitted. And the year is 1965. In the caption, it has the Black soldier saying, quote, "Me, I'm only on my way to save democracy in Vietnam," end quote. And so some of the questions down here are questions like, how many children like cartoons? Why? Who are the two men in the picture? What does democracy mean? What does the soldier mean by saving democracy? Where is Alabama? What does off limits mean? For whom is that sign intended? Okay, so, you know, having some critical conversation about this very kind of political and racially charged cartoon. Where did this come from? This came from a curriculum book aimed at what? Kindergarten and grades 1 and 2. So there was a time in this country where children were having guided, critical discussions around issues of race. And I think that it is a mistake to think that children at younger ages are not equipped to understand or have these conversations. And it's not only children. I have to say, it's not only children. We have plenty of adults who also seem ill-equipped and not ready to have these conversations. But if we are actually going to change the kind of historic trajectory of institutions like law enforcement, of institutions like education, then racial competency is imperative to focus on just as much as we're focusing on issues around curriculum and issues around effective instruction. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Abe. I think we've reached the point in our presentation where we'll have time for a couple questions. Just want to take take this time to ask anyone out there in YouTube who has questions. You can make a comment and we'll get them. They'll get them to us. We do have a quick question from Julia. She says, "How can I, a white college student, help close the gap?"
You said a white college student?
Yeah.
Which gap is she talking about? Is she talking about the achievement gap, the discipline gap? I mean, I suppose if you're in the field, you know, that's one thing. But if you are not in the field, I mean, I suppose that you could volunteer. You know, I suppose that if you have children in school, that could be, you know, you could be part of the PTA and start having these conversations. I mean, I think that there's a variety of ways. But you know, it kind of depends on your career path, and not that you can't do anything about it if you're not within the field, but you know, certainly being within the field would give you more, you know, more ready access to the environments that you're trying to change and kind of have larger discussions with. But you know, also I have to tell you that it's not an easy thing, and it is something that can bring out a tremendous backlash. I mean, I know that, so a couple of years ago, maybe 4 or 5 years ago, Seattle Public Schools started doing like a regular Black Lives Matter type of curriculum piece throughout their schools. And man, the emails that were coming in from parents who were unhappy about that were, I don't want to say surprising, because nothing is a surprise. At least to me, there's nothing is a surprise these days. It just really went to there's a phrase that I love to quote. That's actually it's in the conclusion of Emerald Street: A History of Hip Hop in Seattle, forward by Sir Mix-a-Lot, available from UW Press. But there's in the conclusion, I'm writing about there's this term that's included. It's talking about the illusion of inclusion, and that's something that, especially in Seattle, has done really well. You know what I'm saying? There's a lot of self-congratulatory kind of backpatting around here, just in terms of like, oh, well, at least we're not Alabama when it comes to racial stuff. And I'm like, come on, yo, is that the bar that we're going by? At least we're not Alabama. And so the idea, so even though that we have the kind of historic examples that I was showing earlier in the presentation, we still have the realities of the Seattle Police Department being under investigation for how they treat Black citizens, of Seattle Public Schools being under investigation by the federal government for how they teach or how they treat Black students. And I'm sure that you've heard probably the story about gentrification in Seattle and how the Black community is now having to really try to take steps to make sure that the Black community is not completely erased from the Central District, which was the traditional home of the Black community for many, many, many decades. And so, you know, even though there is a reputation of racial progressiveness, it is in a lot of ways belied by the realities that many people of color are facing here today.
We were able to share on YouTube the link to that book for anyone
excellent.
watching.
Thank you.
But one thing that I asked earlier too was tips for people who maybe have encountered some of this experience through K through 12, but also there's community members watching on YouTube tonight. What kind of maybe tips or advice for parents that might be watching and their kids might be going through some of this? How can they help that student with their academic consciousness or helping them through that?
Right. You know, I would say that follow the advice of some of those slides that I was talking about that I pulled from the Seattle Public Schools, like advocating for yourself and that kind of thing. I mean, I know, and I know that was in the context of kind of kids who had been trained, I guess is not the right word, but had been kind of just programmed to feel like, there was no sense in advocating. But I think as parents going to school council meetings, if you are able to make, semi-regular visits in the classroom, if you're able to maybe volunteer. I know that that's not possible for everybody just because of work things, but keeping the lines of communication open, and also, being in touch with the teacher. And this it can be difficult because having been the teacher, and actually having been a teacher who there were some Black students felt like I had it out for their kid. You know what I'm saying? And so those dynamics still can happen. I don't feel like I did, but certainly, that kid and I certainly had our conflict, but I don't feel like I did. But you know what I'm saying? I felt like I got defensive, you know what I'm saying? But, my energy and attention was less, after that was put forth to me, my energy and attention was less about, being offended and upset by what she said about me and how I was dealing with her child, and more about, okay, what makes her think that? And have I really been doing anything that might play into that? And that's what I was talking about with regard to professional introspection, and not just automatically going to the defense mechanism, which is a natural thing because we all want to think we're doing a good job. But we also need to be open enough to hear somebody tell us when we may not be doing the best job. And so, and parents also have to be prepared for that defensiveness, because like I said, that's, this is nobody on their job likes to be told they're not doing their job well, but if you are talking about and just saying, you may be doing great with these other kids. I'm talking about the relationship with my particular child, you know what I'm saying? And having those conversations. So I definitely encourage people to have conversations with the teachers. And if you know what I'm saying? But I'm not saying anything that a lot of parents don't know. If it doesn't work with the teacher, then you talk to the administrator. But also, if there are teachers watching, developing relationships. I mean, we all know how to develop relationships, and we all know what to do when we think there is a relationship that is important enough to us that we want to keep part of our lives. You know what I'm saying? And so those things, being sincere, going out of your way to you know what I'm saying? If like I said, if it's a situation where you have a student who's like really struggling with their confidence, you know what I'm saying? Doing things, putting them in positions where they can build that confidence, and where they can see themselves in a different light, and where even if they are not believing in themselves, they're able to feel the vibe off you that you believe in them. And even if they don't think they can do it, you think they can do it. If maybe it takes saying that over and over and over again until it gets drilled in. I don't know. Everybody's different. Every teacher-student relationship dynamic is different, but you know what I'm saying? Teachers know, people know kind of what the basis of the situation is. And again, if you're a teacher who's having these troubles with this specific kind of population of children, it might be, time to kind of ask, what does race mean to me? Does race really have a role in how I'm doing my job? And finding thought partners that you can kind of have conversations with, and people who will be honest with you, people who will not just tell you what you want to hear, but what you need to hear, and what they honestly think, and you being able to process that and absorb that and kind of put that in your toolbox and use that in positive ways moving forward.
Dr. Abe, we had a few questions actually come through here at the end. Let's see how quickly maybe we can get some of these. Okay. One of them from Grace is, have the harsh disciplines of students in Seattle gotten better in the last 5 years?
No, in terms of like the disproportionality for discipline, yeah, no, the statistics continue to be dismal. And in fact, I want to say between the last two COVID-free years. So that would have been like 2017 and 18 and 18 and 19. There was an increase. It got worse. You know what I'm saying? And so that's what I was saying earlier, knowing that the problem is there and counteracting it and being able to fix it are two different things. And so, what I'm saying? The district is trying. It ain't like they're unaware, and it ain't like they haven't been aware of this for a long time. I've been, what I'm saying, talking about this stuff around Seattle, in Seattle schools, at school district headquarters for a while now. So it's not like they're unaware, but being able to do something about it, that's the key. And I think that what we're talking about doing is kind of instituting and getting these practices into place so that they can have a chance to kind of take root, and these racial competencies I'm talking about, they have a chance to take root, and see if we can actually make a difference from that.
We have a viewer watching who lives in Spokane and is part of a group called Every Student Counts Alliance. What do you think that would be something that the group could advocate that would be the biggest impact?
I think that having honest conversations around things like race, around things like class, around things like gender would be a great place to start. The only question is, how much buy-in would you be able to get from teachers? Because no teacher is going to want to admit that, I'm saying, I'm racist or I'm biased or anything like that. Or, no person, well, generally speaking, most people don't really want to admit that about themselves. But I guess it's a roadblock to that could be kind of teachers unions, and how powerful teachers unions are, and being able to kind of put the kibosh on a lot of things that they don't like. But no, I think trying to engage in regular, open, honest discussions, and it has to be. You don't want it to be. There's a great term that a guy I used to work with coined to me, so I can't take credit for it. His name's Bernardo Ruiz, and he was the one that told me that you don't want to do what you don't want to do is what he called drive-by professional development. You don't want to do a one-off, what I'm saying, where, okay, maybe there was some good conversations and then there's no follow-up. That was something that I really had to push for at the police academy, because a lot of them were just talking about, well, let's just do like a 1 day, 8-hour training, and then that's it. And I'm like, well, you have to, first of all, 8 hours is too much. You say, for a lot of people who really haven't had to wrestle with these issues, a couple of hours is as much you need to have at a time. But then secondly, people need to have the opportunity to let stuff marinate and kind of think about it, and then come back with follow-up questions or comments. And so you can have an evolving and kind of dynamic dialogue that is not just stagnant after just one simple visit. So I would, the obvious thing is to encourage critical conversations, but the follow-up part of that is I think probably even more important than just having the initial conversation, is allowing people to wrestle with it and have safe spaces where they can ask honest questions. I mean, part of the issue, the struggle I've come up with out at the academy is that, I'm saying, it takes work to create a space where people can feel safe enough to ask a question that might sound racist. I'm saying? It might even be racist on its head. But if it's an honest question, then, I'm saying, you want to facilitate and nurture an environment where people can, I'm saying? Now, if somebody's just going to go off and say something crazy and that kind of thing, and then they keep just going at it session after session after session, and are not really demonstrating that they're trying to challenge their own thinking, I'm saying that's one thing. But I think that the necessary component of the follow-up to these critical conversations, in my view, is just as important as the original conversation itself.
We do have one last question more about the program you were talking about earlier with Seattle U and Seattle Central. How are people of color identified for streamlining to become educators? Are there certified teachers after completing this program, or are they para-educators?
Well, so a lot of them, it's funny. So we started this, we're now on our second cohort. So the second cohort started just this last fall. And so that means our first cohort was fall of 2019. I'm losing track already. I think 2019. And so when we set up the program, there's a program in Seattle called Seattle Promise, where if you graduate from a Seattle public high school, you get 2 years of community college for free. And so what we thought was we would kind of recruit and identify graduating high school seniors to kind of fill the program. But what ended up happening is we ended up getting a whole bunch. So if the first cohort was around 30, probably 8 of them were high school students, and the others were instructional assistants who were already working in Seattle Public Schools, but were looking for an accessible path to certification. And so it kind of caught us off guard, but you know, in a lot of ways, now we're servicing not only these high school students, but also these adults in a lot of situations who are working adults with families. Like I said, some of them have come through with a lot of kind of educational trauma and baggage and their experiences and that. And even though I was talking to them about that kind of thing in the summer bridge that we did in the lead up to the start of the second cohort in the fall, once I started teaching a class with them actually in the class and was seeing how that anxiety really manifested itself, man, I had to adjust my teaching a little bit for them. And you know, it was like a virtual hybrid. And so, you know, we would meet once a week for 3 hours over Zoom and then do the rest online. But, you know, the first 30 minutes of every class session that we would meet over Zoom, I would just devote to talking about not necessarily what's happening in class. We'll get to that. Maybe not maybe what's happening in school, but just opening up, like, how are you doing? How is the program for you? How was your anxiety this week? Did it prevent you from doing anything? You know, using other students as a resource. You know what I'm saying? And one student hears about how another student is struggling, and that's kind of why the cohort model was so important, because we wanted them to kind of build this community and be able to lean on each other in crucial situations. But no, I mean, the program is it's up and running. Right now, we only have it to where we get students their AA, but we are in the process of working to set this up as a BA program so that we don't have to let them, because one of my concerns was that if we have this program and we're super supportive, and then we send them off once they're finished at Seattle Central to a more traditional institution, in some ways we may be setting them up to fail, because they're going to get in there and not have that super supportive structure that helped them be successful. And so some of them may be okay, but some of them may not. And so it's the idea of being consistent and allowing them to work their way through the program. And like I said, the key hope is that they go back into Seattle Public Schools and have their own classrooms. And really, when we have instructors teaching this program, we're not just bringing anybody in. The instructors here, we're trying to be very conscientious about bringing instructors who are culturally responsive, student-centered, so that they can model these things or kind of tenets of the ARE program for the students in the cohort, so that once the students in the cohort get into their own classrooms, they continue to model those traits.
Thank you so much, Dr. Abe. You've given us so much to think about, so much to marinate on, and take back to our own school districts and our own communities here in Spokane. So I just want to say thank you. You can contact Humanities Washington if you have questions and want to connect with Dr. Abe on a personal. I know there's some comments going around that they want to really connect more and see your slides and maybe have you out and present to certain other groups on your work. So
right now in the chat, I'm going to put my email address.
Okay. And we'll get that out on the YouTube chat so people can see that. And so, so we want to make sure that the work continues. And like you said, it's not just one conversation. It needs to kind of marinate and then continue to have these conversations. And that's what Spokane Community College is trying to do with this speaker series, is to continue to have these conversations. So thank you so much. I know we've been way over time, but appreciate all the knowledge that you've dropped with us tonight.
Thank you. And y'all out there, keep doing what you're doing. I appreciate you.